The winter of 1945 wrapped Germany in silence, a silence so deep it seemed the land itself had stopped breathing. Roads that once thundered with tanks were now choked with rubble and ash. Cities stood like hollowed-out skeletons of brick and memory. Somewhere near the Elbe River, as dusk bled into the horizon, the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground echoed through the ruins. It was the sound of two armies meeting not as enemies, but as survivors. On that bitter evening, an American infantry patrol moved cautiously through what had once been a small Saxon village. Smoke curled from the blackened ruins of cottages, their timbers creaking under the weight of snow. The air smelled of soot and damp stone. Private First Class Robert Keene, a 23-year-old from Ohio, tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes sweeping the shattered street. Every shadow could be danger. Every movement could mean the war still had one last sting left to give. Behind a collapsed church wall, a faint sob caught his attention. The men froze. Keene signaled the others to stay back and stepped forward alone. Beneath the grey light of evening he saw her, a young woman in a torn wool coat, her hands trembling around a small locket pressed to her chest. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes hollow from nights without sleep. Around her lay the remnants of her world, a burnt cradle, a broken chair, and a heap of frozen laundry that no one would ever claim again. When she saw the uniform, she flinched, expecting violence. But Keene didn't raise his weapon. He simply stood there, caught between duty and compassion. He'd seen death before, on beaches, in forests, on the march across Europe, but this was different. This was the quiet aftermath that no training manual could prepare a man for. He lowered his rifle, removed his helmet, and spoke softly, though she likely couldn't understand his English. "It's over," he murmured. "It's done." The woman whispered something in German. Her words were broken, fragments of grief spilling out like shards of glass. She told him, half speaking, half crying, that she had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, her brother in Dresden, and her parents in an air raid. "Ich habe alle verloren," she said. "I lost everyone." Her voice cracked like the church bells that no longer rang. Keene didn't know the exact words, but he understood the meaning. He felt it in the hollow quiet between them. For a moment neither moved. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting through the open rafters of the ruined chapel. Keene reached into his pack and took out a small tin of rations, half a chocolate bar, and a piece of bread hardened by the cold. He knelt and placed them gently on the ground between them. The woman hesitated, then took the bread with shaking fingers. She looked at him, confusion mixing with disbelief. War had taught both of them to hate, but it had also exhausted that hatred. For the American soldier, this was no longer the enemy. This was a human being left behind in a world destroyed by other men's decisions. For the German woman, the sight of an Allied uniform no longer meant terror, but survival. She whispered, "Warum? Why?" And Keene, searching for something beyond orders, answered softly, "Because you still have me." The words came out raw, spontaneous, and heavier than he realized. She didn't understand their full meaning, not then, but the tone carried through the cold air. It wasn't romance nor pity. It was humanity resurfacing after years of darkness. Keene watched her eat slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear. He saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Around them, the landscape of Europe's war lay in ruin. Bridges collapsed across the Elbe. Entire divisions had vanished in encirclements. Cities burned until only church steeples marked where homes once stood. The Allied front pushed eastward, the Red Army pressed west, and between them, caught in the collapsing lungs of the Reich, millions of civilians wandered through the wreckage, searching for faces that no longer existed. Keene's patrol set up camp nearby, the remnants of a platoon once meant to storm Berlin before the High Command decided to halt. The men were tired of glory. They'd seen too many empty fields filled with crosses, too many faces like hers. They brewed coffee from melted snow, shared cigarettes, and stared into the distance as artillery echoed faintly from the east. That night, Keene sat by the small fire they'd built among the ruins. The woman sat opposite him, wrapped in a blanket one of the soldiers had given her. Her eyes reflected the flames, small, uncertain sparks of warmth returning after endless cold. Every now and then she looked up, studying these strangers who had arrived not as conquerors, but as witnesses. In the distance, a lone cow lowed from somewhere unseen, a reminder that life still lingered. The men listened to a radio transmission crackling through static, rumors of Hitler's bunker, of cities surrendering one by one. But for the people sitting there in that broken village, the war's end didn't sound like victory. It sounded like exhaustion. Keene thought about his home in Ohio, about his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, and the sound of trains passing by the river. He wondered what this woman had called home before the bombs fell. She had no name for him, and he didn't ask for one. In war, names were luxuries easily lost. They were just two souls suspended in the final quiet of history's loudest storm. At dawn, the sky was pale and endless. The patrol prepared to move again. Keene gave the woman one last ration pack and gestured toward the west. There would be refugee convoys soon, aid stations, and a chance to live. She nodded silently. When he turned to leave, she reached out and caught his sleeve, whispering words that trembled with gratitude and grief. He didn't understand them, but he didn't need to. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the fragile strength in her eyes. As they marched away, the snow began to fall harder, covering footprints, softening ruins, and erasing borders. The war was ending, but its echoes would linger in every silent village and every scarred memory. Keene didn't know it then, but that brief moment, the woman, her tears, his answer, would follow him long after the uniform came off. Behind them, she watched until the figures disappeared into the mist. Her breath clouded there, and her hands clasped the locket tighter. Somewhere within that silence, she felt something stir again. Hope faint but alive, because even at the end of the world, when everything was taken, sometimes one voice saying, "You still have me," could be enough to start again. The following days blurred into a grey haze of frost and marching boots. The war was fracturing, but it wasn't yet finished. The American lines had reached the Elbe, where orders were clear. Hold, wait for contact with the Soviets, and prepare for the uneasy peace that would follow. For Private Robert Keene and his exhausted platoon, it was a strange kind of limbo, caught between combat and compassion, between victory and the guilt that came with seeing what victory really meant. Rumors swept through the ranks like wind through broken rafters. They said the Reich was collapsing from within, that entire units were surrendering in droves, and that the men guarding the last bridges had long since dropped their rifles. But there were also whispers of scattered resistance, of fanatics hiding in the forests, still loyal to a dead ideology. For men like Keene, that meant every step forward could still be the last. The German woman's face lingered in his thoughts, like a phantom of conscience he couldn't shake. It was on the 5th morning that orders came down for reconnaissance toward a small rail junction east of the Elbe. Intelligence believed remnants of an SS column were retreating through the area. The village, Hagenfeld, had once been a proud farming town, now a maze of craters and half-buried tracks. The 2nd Battalion of the 29th Infantry Division moved in cautious silence, every man aware that peace was not yet guaranteed by the calendar. The fields were slick with melting snow. In the distance, smoke coiled upward, a reminder that not every German soldier had yet laid down his arms. They found bodies along the road, some in black uniforms, others in civilian coats. Deserters, perhaps. A German half-track lay overturned in a ditch, riddled with bullet holes. It had burned until the metal warped into shapes that no longer resembled a machine of war. As they entered the outskirts, a low rumble grew louder. Not artillery this time, engines. From the far end of the street, an American M4A3 Sherman tank rolled into view, its olive armor streaked with soot and mud. The name Liberty Belle was painted across its turret in white letters. Inside the tank, Sergeant Will Doherty and his crew scanned the ruins through periscopes, guns at the ready. The tank's 75 mm cannon, with its 2,600-foot effective range, could turn a stone farmhouse into dust in seconds. Doherty's tank was part of the same spearhead that had crossed the Rhine a month earlier. Engineers at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant had designed the Sherman for speed and reliability rather than brute armor. A compromise that frustrated many crews but kept them moving when heavier German Tigers bogged down in the mud. The tank's Continental R975 engine could push it up to 25 miles per hour, fast enough to outmaneuver even a Panther if the ground allowed. The secret wasn't strength, it was adaptability, the same quality keeping men like Keene alive. They advanced slowly, infantry spread wide. The town was too quiet. Birds didn't sing. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before moving through the empty alleys. Keene led his fire team along a narrow lane, flanked by collapsed houses. He could feel the weight of his rifle like an extra heartbeat against his shoulder. When a door creaked open ahead, he raised the barrel instinctively, then froze. A child stood there, a boy no older than 7, pale and trembling, his hands clutching a piece of white cloth tied to a stick. Behind him, an old woman appeared, her eyes wide with fear. They weren't soldiers. They were the ones who had survived what soldiers began. Keene signaled his men to hold. The boy took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough for Keene to see the dirt smudged across his face. He lowered his rifle once more. The villagers had hidden in cellars when the last SS units retreated, fearing both sides equally. But word had spread. American troops meant food, medicine, and restraint. Slowly, others emerged from the ruins. Keene watched as faces appeared one by one, thin from hunger, eyes red from smoke and sleepless nights. It wasn't victory they saw approaching, it was deliverance. The medics set up a small station in the town square. The quartermaster truck arrived hours later, distributing what they could spare: rations, bandages, even soap. Keene helped unload crates, his hands numb from the cold. That was when he saw her again. The same woman from the ruined church, the one who had said she'd lost everyone. She stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching that same locket, watching him with disbelief that seemed too fragile to trust. Their eyes met through the drifting snow. She hesitated before approaching, her steps slow and uncertain. He smiled faintly, though he couldn't quite find the words. She looked thinner, but her face had changed. The terror was still there, but something else had replaced the emptiness, a flicker of recognition that not all soldiers were monsters. Keene guided her toward the medic's tent, motioning that she could stay. She spoke softly, telling him fragments of her days since they parted. She had walked for miles searching for food, following rumors of American camps where civilians were fed. "Ich dachte du wärst fort," she whispered. "I thought you were gone." Keene didn't need to answer. In that moment, the noise of the world seemed to fade again. The rumble of engines and the distant shouts were all drowned by the fragile bond of survival. As the sun sank behind the ruins, the Sherman crew shut down their engine. Doherty climbed from the hatch, stretching his aching limbs. He surveyed the scene, his tank scarred but still running, his men alive, the civilians slowly rebuilding fires from broken timbers. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was what victory looked like now. Life continuing in the aftermath of ruin. Engineers and planners far from the front had imagined war in terms of tonnage, fuel, and production quotas. But here, those calculations ended in faces, tired, gaunt, human. Each ration pack, each gallon of gasoline that kept a tank running, represented the endless logistics chain stretching from American factories to the front lines. The engineers back home, men and women at plants in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo, had unknowingly built the bridge that allowed this meeting, this fragile exchange of humanity to even occur. When night fell again, the campfire flickered between Keene and the woman. Neither spoke much. The air carried a faint scent of pine mixed with smoke. Somewhere a gramophone crackled with a song broadcast over the division radio, a slow tune about home. Keene thought of the world they'd left behind, and how in this strange place he had somehow found a piece of it again. But even as they shared this quiet, the eastern horizon glowed faintly red. The Soviets were advancing fast. Orders would come soon. The Americans would have to pull back to the western bank and leave the civilians to fate once more. Keene didn't yet know it, but dawn would bring that order. And when it did, he would face a choice between duty and the promise he made to a woman who had already lost everything once before. The snow stopped falling just before midnight. The world seemed to pause. The embers crackled, and in that stillness, a question hung unspoken in the air, whether mercy could survive the machinery of orders and whether one soldier's word could mean anything when armies moved like tides. The answer would come with sunrise. The first light of morning crept over Hagenfeld like the breath of a waking ghost. Frost shimmered on rooftops, and the faint smoke of campfires rose into a sky streaked with pale gold. The village was quiet again, but not empty. American troops were already preparing to withdraw to the western side of the Elbe. Trucks rumbled to life, exhaust curling in the cold air. Men packed their gear with the mechanical precision of habit. The war had taught them to move quickly, to leave nothing behind but footprints, and sometimes even those disappeared with the next snowfall. Keene sat near the half-frozen river, watching the mist rise from the water. He could hear the faint chatter of soldiers behind him, the scraping of boots on metal, as the tanks rolled toward the makeshift bridge. The order had come at dawn. All civilian contact to cease, all displaced persons to be handed over to relief authorities once Soviet forces arrived. The maps were drawn, and men's fates were being rearranged by pencils hundreds of miles away. He didn't look back at first. He didn't have to. He already knew she was there. The soft crunch of her steps on the frost gave her away. When he turned, he found her standing just a few yards away, wrapped in that same coat, her locket still hanging around her neck. Her expression was unreadable, part fear, part understanding. She had heard the engines too. He rose slowly, taking off his helmet. "We're moving out," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. She couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the truth of them in the way he looked at her. The river separated not just armies now, but worlds. Soon, the Red Army would arrive, and she would fall under a new kind of rule. The war might be ending, but its ghosts were only beginning to stir. For a moment they simply stood there, facing each other as the convoy lined up behind him. The sound of engines and shouted orders faded beneath the weight of silence. Then she stepped forward, pulled the locket from around her neck, and pressed it into his hand. Inside was a small photograph, faded, barely visible. A man in uniform holding her shoulders, their smiles captured before the storm began. She said something softly, her voice trembling. He couldn't understand the words, but he caught the meaning. This was her past, and now she was giving it away. He hesitated, then closed her hand around the locket again. "No," he said gently, shaking his head. "Keep it. You'll need it more than me." She stared at him for a long time, tears catching the light of the rising sun. Finally, she whispered something he would remember for the rest of his life. "Vergiss mich nicht. Don't forget me." He smiled faintly, though his throat tightened around the words he wanted to say. Then, without ceremony, he turned and joined his platoon. The trucks rolled forward, the engines growled, and the riverbank began to vanish behind a curtain of fog. He looked back one last time as the bridge creaked under their weight. She was still there, standing alone by the river, her figure small against the pale horizon. Then the mist swallowed her whole. By noon, the column reached the western side of the Elbe. The landscape stretched endlessly, a mix of farmland, wreckage, and the charred remains of towns that had once fed the Reich's war machine. For the soldiers, the end of combat did not mean the end of war. It lingered in their bones, in the sounds that haunted their sleep. They'd seen liberation, but they'd also seen starvation. They'd brought freedom, but they'd also carried destruction. The line between savior and destroyer had grown thin, nearly invisible. In the weeks that followed, word spread fast. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. Men who had lived for nothing but survival now faced the uncertain peace. Some celebrated, others simply sat in silence, trying to remember what normal life had felt like before everything turned to fire. Keene received orders for redeployment home in late June. When he packed his duffel, he found a small scrap of fabric folded carefully inside, a remnant of the German woman's scarf. He didn't remember keeping it. Maybe she'd slipped it there before he left. Maybe it had clung to his gear by accident. Either way, it stayed. Back in Ohio, the world seemed impossibly clean. Streets were whole. Houses stood untouched by shellfire, and laughter drifted from windows without fear of air raid sirens. But for Keene, the silence of peace carried a different weight. He found work at a small hardware store and tried to blend into the rhythm of daily life. Yet each night, as the trains passed by the river, he would remember the faint sound of her voice over the wind, the look in her eyes when she said, "Vergiss mich nicht." Years passed. The war faded into history books, into medals displayed behind glass, and into photographs tucked away in attics. But for those who had lived it, time didn't erase. It only softened the edges. As Keene grew older, his hair turned the color of the snow that once fell on Hagenfeld. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still see the falling ash, the ruined church, and the woman clutching her locket. He wondered if she'd survived the chaos that followed, if she'd rebuilt her life under the new flag that now flew over her homeland. The world moved on. Nations rebuilt, enemies became allies, and technology turned battlefields into memories. Yet behind every treaty, every speech, there remained countless small stories, moments where humanity flickered back to life amid the wreckage. A shared meal, a word of kindness, a promise whispered in a language not fully understood. These were the quiet victories that no medal recorded, but which defined what it meant to endure. Keene never returned to Europe, but decades later, after his passing, his granddaughter found a small wooden box among his things. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a photograph he'd kept hidden from everyone. It showed a woman standing near a broken bridge, her face half turned toward the camera. Faded, almost erased by time, but still there. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 3 words, "You still have me." No one in the family knew the story. They only knew their grandfather rarely spoke of the war. But to him, that single encounter, those few words exchanged among ruins, had mattered more than all the medals and citations combined. It was proof that even in humanity's darkest chapter, kindness could survive the flames. And somewhere across the ocean, in a quiet German village rebuilt from rubble, a woman grew old too. She never forgot the American soldier who offered her bread and hope when both were scarce. She kept a faded scrap of khaki cloth tucked inside her locket until the day she died. When her granddaughter asked her why she never took it out, she simply smiled and said, "Because it reminds me that even when I lost everything, someone told me I wasn't alone. History would remember the tanks, the generals, and the treaties." But what endured were these moments. The fragile threads connecting enemies turned humans again. In the end, the war that divided continents had also revealed something indestructible, the capacity for mercy. As the years faded into memory, the snow still fell each winter over the Elbe, silent and unjudging. The river kept flowing, washing away footprints, but not the echoes of those who had once stood on its banks. And in that timeless current, somewhere between loss and redemption, one truth remained. When everything else is gone, the smallest act of compassion can still outlast the war that tried to erase it.